Okay, part two of the glaze lecture, still talking about high fire glaze. Silica, flux, and clay. That's what makes up glaze. Now, the silica, remember, is sand, basically, pulverized sand that comes from quartz, not just any sand, right? And that's what actually makes the glass. That's what makes the glassy substance. Now, the flux we didn't talk so much about. What flux does is it helps melt that silica at a lower temperature. So fluxes are like sodium, lithium, potassium. These are all metals that melt at kind of a lower temperature and help melt that ground up quartz. So this makes the glass. This helps melt that to make the glass. What does clay do? Well, clay does a number of things in glaze. So three things. Clay, which is also known as kaolin, three things kaolin does in glaze. All right, so number one, it controls the flow of the glaze at MP. That's melting point. So this glaze is in the kiln, right? The pot's already been fired. We dip it in glaze, then we put it back in the kiln to fire it again, and this glaze melts. If it doesn't have a lot of kaolin in the glaze will just run. In other words, the flow won't be controlled. If it has more kaolin in it, then the glaze won't run as much. So you can kind of affect how glazes run in the kiln at melting point, right? Which in this case, when we're talking about these glazes, is 2,345 degrees Fahrenheit, right? Those are the glaze, we're talking about high fire glaze, and that's the melting point for high fire glaze. The second thing that kaolin does in a glaze is it affects the visual properties. All right, it affects the visual properties of the glassy substance that we call glaze, all right? Affects the visual properties of the glaze. So window glass, right, which is just silica and flux, we can see right through it. So the more clay, can I see through this clay cup? I can't, right? The more clay that we put into this mixture, the less like window glass it's going to be. So if I put more clay in it, it's going to be less runny, but it's also going to be less glossy, less transparent. If I put a whole bunch of clay in my glaze, the glaze will be like opaque, meaning I can't see through it, and it might not be glossy at all. It might be matte, right? Not shiny. All right. The third thing that kaolin does in a glaze is it helps suspend the glaze materials in the water mixture. So since we've been all online, I've been glazing for you guys, so you wouldn't know this, but these powdered materials that make up glaze, we mix them up in a bucket of water. And I'll tell you, if we didn't have any clay, if it was just silica and flux in this bucket of water, the silica and the flux would just settle to the bottom of the bucket. It would be very difficult for me to get a nice even coat of glaze on there. Now, you guys have all mixed clay with water. You've made slip. And if you mix it up really well, it doesn't separate right away. So clay also helps keep everything buoyant in the bucket so that it's a nice substance to dip our bisque-fired pots in and get a nice even coat of glaze. All right? Okay, so that is the glaze lecture part 2.